Hey, everybody. This is Alexander Hall with Dispute Defense Consulting. I'm hopping in for live video to discuss the ongoing trends that we've been hit by in 2022 and discuss different data breaches and different sources of information that are being exploited by all of the bad guys. And also make some projections for 2023 along with some strategy items that we can begin to implement today in order to be prepared for the eventuality that's before us. So with that being said, we can't talk about 2022 without talking about data breaches. The important thing to remember about data breaches are it affects every company. Retailers that hold information, whether it's login information or personal identity details, things like that, or financial institutions that handle people's finance information and very sensitive identity information, so it'll be social security numbers and so on. That information is all being used by bad guys to commit various forms of fraud. I typically link those into three categories. One is going to be identity information. So that'll be your name, that'll be your phone number, email address, physical addresses, so on and so forth, all the way down to social security numbers, date of births, so on. Next was going to be login details. We've seen a lot of companies be breached for login details, and those same login details being used across the spectrum of the marketplace, for nefarious account takeovers, ATOs, as we're calling it. Third is payment information. Well, that's not going anywhere. That's something that has maintained consistent in all of our efforts. People that take a hold of different sets of payment information, whether it's checking account information or credit card information, typing it into a checkout form, and seeing what level of success is available to them. In addition to ATOs, payment fraud, and compromised identity sets, we're also seeing buy now, pay later being exploited because of the information that's available out there. Now, BNPL took off really well earlier this year. And for those of you who don't know, BNPL is buy, pay later. Some of your favorite merchants are offering payments for the items that otherwise certain people couldn't afford. It's a great initiative, but it is not infallible. And what we're finding, or what we have found, what has been reported over the course of the year, is that the system has been exploited, whether by dishonest customers, dishonest consumers, or fraudsters. They get a hold of the certain sets of identity information and have enough money in an account to make the initial deposit, and then they ghost on the accounts. Unfortunately, we've seen a lot of volatility in the marketplace for BNPL service providers, leading to problems for merchants. Next, it's important to talk about what's been going on for the last couple of years, but we've seen a huge explosion this year. It just continues to grow. So that's going to be dishonest consumer practices. So that could be first-party fraud, also called friendly fraud. I choose to call it chargeback abuse because they're abusing the chargeback system. That's very important to keep in mind that they're abusing the chargeback system. And again, for those who don't know, chargeback abuse is when a good consumer passes all the security checkpoints for validation and verification, and then on the back end of the transaction, file a chargeback unjustifiably to get their money back on an order that they themselves placed. Now, when you're dealing with chargeback, with friendly fraud chargeback or chargeback abuse, you're dealing with, as I stated, good customers. Well, the problem here is they beat all of the fraud prevention tools that we have in place. We seek to verify that this consumer, that this account, that this checkout is verified, that they have the authority to put through the transaction. So they meet all of our needs. They meet all of the checkpoints that we set in place. That, of course, has become a big problem. And with that introduces one of the dimensions that I call a fraud prevention. We'll get into that in a little bit. The last thing I wanted to talk about was mail theft. Mail theft is a big deal, especially right now, it seems, and especially during the holiday season of every year. In mail, it is typical for a fraudster to obtain identity information, bank statements, different types of profile information, checks that go out from businesses for payment, checks being sent through the mail by consumers, cash, birthday cards. Everything goes through the mail. Some iteration of everything goes to the mail, including gift cards. Can't forget about gift cards. Some iteration of everything goes through the mail. And for fraudsters, it's a very valuable way to get a hold of valuable information that's viable in the marketplace for different reasons. And of course, everything breaks down into these two uh, these two sets of data. So you're going to have payment information, the checks, the gift cards, the bank statements that have the transactions listed there. You can create checks if you have specific information. There's a whole wide world of information that can get through the mail for payment information. And then, of course, you have the identity information. You have thing that goes through the mail, right? So imagine it. Anything that you send that has your social security number on it, anything that says your date of birth, anything that says anything. And then business details are going through the mail as well. All of that is to say that mail is a very viable source of information for fraudsters. And it's used in many different ways that we've all covered throughout the year. Yeah. So as we move into 2023, I feel it is important to reflect on what has been during 2022 and talk about the notable threats to the marketplace. My projections. If I were still a bad guy, what would I be doing? So the idea that I see being very valuable and not yet taking off is the use of identity information. Okay, so we always see payment information being used. Got it. We always see login information, or now we've become comfortable with seeing a login information being used, ATOs. Got it. What we have not seen, or maybe we just don't have the data in place to see, is the manipulation and deployment of compromised identity information. In one of the roundtable episodes, I went over the entire compromised identity set, manipulation all the way out to the credit reports, freezing the credit lines and things like that. I would suggest that you go check that out if you're a financial institution or a vendor or a company that falls under the classification of fintech, right? So that will include your cryptos, your investment portfolios, your NFTs, your iGaming, your esports, anything where there's a bucket for a fraudster to get a funding account and put stuff into, or to establish a credit line, or to create a bank account that is like a third-party bank account that you can use to fund with another account. Fraudsters look at it this way. All of this fintech information is just a bucket to put money into that they then control and take it away. So it's very important. As we move into 23, I think identity theft is going to take over, and a subsidiary method of that is going to be third-party ATOs. So as I mentioned just a second ago, a fraudster approaches all of these different companies and all these different consumer offerings to create a bucket, to take other payment information or to take funds out of another account and put it into the bucket, control it, and use as they see fit. Third-party ATOs is one thing that I'm familiar with from my past, and I think it's going to present itself here very shortly. And there's two reasons for that. One is the amount of different buckets that exist. As I said, investment portfolios, crypto, NFTs, iGaming, deposits and withdrawals. To a fraudster, all of these different buckets are ways to take money and put it into a bucket for control and take it away afterwards. Very important to keep this in mind as we move forward. And third-party ATOs, the process works like this. A compromised identity set is used to create a fintech account somewhere. We'll call it the fintech account A. Easy. In creating that account and linking a funding account, it's at the platforms typically ask for a verification via microdeposits. The microdeposit system is fallible. It's more fallible than infallible. It should not be leveraged anymore, in my opinion, but it is. Without proper verifications on our microdeposits, we're not able to ownership. We're not able to verify true ownership of the funding account to the fintech account. Fraudsters know this, or at least I knew this 10 years ago. And so what the idea is to establish the fintech account, go through the process of linking a funding account, an established account over here, and link the two via the archaic microdeposit system. Now, for those who don't know, the process goes like this. You make the request, and it says put in your ACH, bank details, put in your details over here. They go and create 2 deposits around $1, under $1. I've seen different amounts go through. And when you verify those deposit amounts, you've effectively linked the 2 accounts. Okay. Well, the problem here is by doing it and going that path, you're not verifying ownership. You're just proving that someone has access to the transaction history, which brings us to the second point. The second point is how easy it is to get a hold of transaction information, transaction history, through these various FI institutions and fintech offerings, right? Anywhere where you can create that bucket, right? There are some companies out there where a stolen check has all the information needed in order to access the transaction history. One stolen check. So one stolen check accompanied with one set of compromised identity information can make a third-party ATO method come to life. Create the account at the fintech, link the established account by verifying through the transaction history the microdeposits. Now they're linked. So now what? Now the fraudster goes back to the fintech platform over here, and they begin to create all of these requests, whatever the request may be, a deposit, a payment. Maybe they get a hold of the fintech card, like how back in the day you were able to do this with different service providers, get a hold of the fintech card and begin to make payments in store, online, whatever it might be. Then there's the expansion of that to go into virtual credit cards. So you create 20 or 30 cards, all with funds coming from an established account that was hijacked via third-party ATOs. Moving on from there, we have credit profile manipulation. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this, I went over a whole hour-long discussion on the Fraud Prevention Roundtable series about the manipulation of profile information. Profiles are compromised identity sets. I go into deep detail over there, but I'll outline the 4 major steps. One is account reassignment. The fraudster has access to accounts, various accounts, whether this is telecom companies, financial institutions, issuing banks with credit cards, so on and so forth. And they assign access to this account or ownership of this account, whatever it might be, co-signing privileges, anything, authorization to the account, to the compromised profile. Well, over time, and if the fraudster knows which accounts to use for this, they will begin getting reports on that account on their credit report. So that's account reassignment. How to get established information associated with this new compromised identity profile. 2 is superficial manipulation. So creating emails, creating phone numbers, creating social media presence, creating scam account or spam accounts where they sign up for these newsletters. All of these accounts report, if you're aware of how these data aggregation companies work, all of these various accounts report to a centralized database of what's then considered reliable information. So by injecting new information into it and making it reliable, the fraudster begins to associate new emails, new phone numbers, new social media profiles to the compromised profile. The third set is credit injection. The third part of this whole method is called credit injection. So by this point, it would be expected that the fraudster was able to flesh out the profile, which is what we called compromised identity sets, flesh out the profile enough to get access to the credit report. Well, after looking at enough credit reports, the fraudster understands what type of accounts report to the credit bureaus, what type of accounts are leveraged here, what type of accounts are leveraged there. And with that set of information, they go and apply for secured cards. They go and apply for low-level phone accounts, low-level credit union bank accounts, mule accounts, as we in the industry are becoming familiar with. They link all of these new accounts knowing, or they establish all of these accounts knowing that over time it's going to report to the credit profile. That process is called credit injection. Now the fraudster has been able to associate new accounts to it. Now they move on to the 4th step, freeze the credit. Before they're ready to freeze the credit, they've established new phone numbers, new emails, new social media presence. They've created new accounts, mule accounts. They've created all of this secondary piece of the puzzle to make identity information work to their benefit. Now, freezing the credit effectively locks the real identity, the victim, out of their own credit profile, which is why Thomas O'Malley and I are staunch advocates in our idea that everyone should freeze their credit. So, for those of you watching this on YouTube, you're more the consumer base, please freeze your credit. Because if you don't, a fraudster will do it for you. That's the manipulation process for manipulating credit profiles. Now let's talk about the viability of all of this. An effective fraudster will have mountains of information. Mountains. It sounds like a lot of work per profile, and it is to figure it all out. But now we're seeing evidence that fraudsters are slowly figuring it out. I halted my operations 6 years ago and wasn't doing anything as robust as this for several years before then. So we're talking about 10 years it's taken for fraudsters to begin to catch up to where I was, but they're doing it. And that's a scary thought. So how do we identify this? What are strategy items that we can deploy moving into 2023? Okay, there's three things really to do. One, financial institutions. Understand that more than taking money from you, fraudsters are also looking to create accounts under your banner to funnel money through. This, of course, will contribute to AML. This, of course, will contribute to wire fraud. This, of course, can translate from payment fraud into funding accounts for mule accounts. There's a lot of terms to go over. The primary idea is to understand that everything you offer to a user of yours, a good consumer, a good user, is something that a fraudster can add to their tool belt. So that's one. Make sure that every single one of your touch points, every one of your use cases, everything that you offer to your consumer, to your user, to your customer, is being monitored in some way and verified some way by your fraud team. So that all of that is to say, create an holistic fraud prevention strategy that considers every touch point across the customer experience journey. So a common set would be behavioral analytics when they first touch down on site. Two would be using a GDPR compliant PII vendor for your KYC at onboarding. Three would be using the same information as onboarding or expanding out to session data and device fingerprinting in order to verify whether or not this correct login information that's been entered is being done so on a device that we should trust. So we've got PII KYC, we've got behavioral analytics, we've got session data, we've got device fingerprinting, and we've only covered 3 touch points. Moving forward on credit applications, we revert back to the PII KYC with the GDPR compliant vendor. As these applications come through, we're going to see the information, and this is a good opportunity for me to introduce what I'm calling the 3 dimensions of fraud prevention. So I will. The first dimension is validation. Is the information correct? Well, fraudsters are very good at entering correct information. Okay, so it's not enough to just validate the information. It's not enough to say, is the information correct? We have to move forward to that and verify authority to the information. So what does that entail? Well, besides the information that's being typed into a form, there's a lot of information that's being given to us with that interaction. As I mentioned, behavioral analytics. As I mentioned, session data. As I mentioned, device fingerprinting. None of that information is submitted consciously by the user that's trying to type in the information for ATOs or submit the credit application. But all of it is useful in an effective fraud prevention strategy. Moving along from there, the third dimension, identify intent. In order to identify intent, we have to take all of the data points that are available to us, understand what they represent, and then have to understand what the story is. So to break this down a little bit, we've done enough to validate whether or not the information is correct. We've started across the board to verify authority to information, whether this person is who they claim to be, by taking in additional information than what is submitted during the form. Okay, that's good. Now 3, zoom out and tell the whole story between your fraud team, between your account managers, between your sales team, whatever it may be. Zoom out and tell the whole story. The reason why this is so important is if we look at the details outlined during my credit profile manipulation method, those 4 steps that I just went over. If you zoom out and look at all the data points, we first can see whether or not the data points are accurate. Well, yes, they will be. Cool. 2, we verify whether or not the person has authority to. Well, they do, because the fraudster will have made it look that way. Okay? So how does identifying the intent come into play? Well, the idea would be to identify evidence of a compromised set of identity information. So how do we do that? Well, if you play through those 4 methods, you'll quickly see that in the data sets that we leverage, the data points that are being introduced, they're going to come into play while the old ones are still moving. That's not typical consumer behavior. A normal consumer will get rid of an old phone number when they get a new one. They'll get rid of an old phone when they get a new one. They'll move to a new address and stop using the old one. So I call this identifying non-unilateral changes across an identity data set. And what your fraud team should be looking for is, have new phone numbers, email addresses, social media platforms, accounts, blah, 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 been added? Yes. Okay. Are the old ones still in play? Yes. That should be seen as suspicious. That's one thing that I can submit to you guys to start looking at whenever you're dealing with the idea of compromised identity information. So I wanted to submit that here. I think I went over all the items I wanted to do. Yeah, there we go. Just wanted to check my notes. All right, guys. I hope you have a great holiday season. I hope everything goes well for you. I hope you spend a lot of time with your family. On the other side, and as we get into 2023, Dispute Defense, Mr. Alexander Hall here, and Dispute Defense are opening up our training schedule for both financial institutions, fintechs, and everything under that designation. Crypto companies, NFTs, investment portfolios, things like that. We're opening up our training to make sure that everybody is up to speed on what the method development process is for fraudsters and what they can do to respond to it proactively. The best proactive response is going to be an holistic response, or a holistic response. I guess it's up in the air as to how to say that correctly. All right, guys, have a great end of year. Wish you all the luck. If you have any questions or want to get in contact with me, there's a QR code on screen, or you can head on over to disputedefenseconsulting.com and book a call for yourselves. All right, happy holidays. Have a great day.